We know that the FBI has been back out in the neighborhood following up on leads, that there's still DNA testing happening behind the scenes. So
they dragged him out of his house and drove away with him. There was time to save him. People need to call 9.
At 1:47 in the morning, the camera went dark. Not because the battery died, not because of a software glitch, not because of a power outage in the neighborhood. Someone walked up to that door in the deep quiet of a Sunday morning in January in a residential neighborhood in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona, and deliberately, methodically, disconnected the only electronic witness standing between an 84-year-old woman and whatever was coming for her. And then, 25 minutes later, at 2:12 in the morning, the camera's internal software still managed to register a motion alert. A system designed to detect the presence of a person picked up something. Something moved near that house. Something that the camera could feel even after someone had tried to make it blind. And at 2:28 in the morning, a pacemaker application, an app designed to monitor the electrical rhythms of a fragile human heart, disconnected from its paired smartphone. By 11:56 that morning, when her family arrived at her front door after she failed to appear at church, they found her personal belongings still inside her phone, her medication, her keys, all of it left behind, as though she expected to return at any moment. But outside that door, the forensic evidence told a different story entirely. There was blood on the porch, and that blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. She was gone, and within 24 hours, something happened that would transform this case from a missing persons investigation into one of the most analytically complicated and disputed cases in recent American true crime history. The ransom notes began. Not one note, not a discreet communication sent to the family through a private channel. Multiple notes, sent to multiple news outlets, arriving across multiple days, demanding millions of dollars in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, from the family of an 84-year-old grandmother who disappeared in the middle of the night. Notes with Bitcoin wallet addresses, notes with deadlines, notes with ultimatums. And here is what investigators never told the public in plain terms. Even as this case dominated the national news cycle for more than 2 months, the FBI never confirmed that a single one of those ransom notes was authentic. Not one. That is the contradiction that investigators cannot ignore. That is the question that changes the shape of everything that followed. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Nancy Ellen Long was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She turned 84 years old just 4 days before she disappeared. For more than 5 decades, she had built her life in the Tucson area, having relocated there with her family in the early 1970s. She was a woman of consistent, quiet routine. She attended church faithfully. She had mobility issues that limited her independence. She required daily medication, and she had a pacemaker, an implanted cardiac device whose companion application was connected to her smartphone, monitoring the electrical activity of her heart at all times and transmitting data that could be reviewed by her medical team. She lived alone in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, a quiet suburban residential area situated on the northeastern edge of Tucson. She maintained a home in a community where people knew their neighbors and where the rhythms of daily life were predictable. She was not, by any visible measure, a woman who represented an obvious target. She was not wealthy by the standards of those who typically attract high-profile kidnapping attempts. She was not a public figure herself. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman of faith who had spent her long life in the same part of the same state, surrounded by family. But she was the mother of one of the most recognized faces in American broadcast journalism, Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the longest-running morning programs in television history. A woman whose image and voice reach millions of viewers every weekday morning. And that fact, that specific familial connection, would become one of the most complicated variables in this entire investigation. On the evening of Saturday, January 31, 2026, everything about Nancy Guthrie's day was ordinary. At 5:32 in the afternoon, records confirm she used a rideshare service to travel to her daughter Annie Guthrie's home for dinner. Annie and her husband, Tommaso Cioni, live in the Tucson area as well. The family gathered. They shared a meal, the kind of ordinary evening that families do not document or memorialize because there is no reason to think it will be the last. Sometime close to 9:48 that night, Tommaso Cioni, Annie's husband, Nancy's son-in-law, dropped her off at her own residence. The garage door opened. The garage door closed. She was inside. She was home. She appeared to be safe. That was the last confirmed moment anyone who loved her saw her alive. Now let us walk through the timestamps. Precisely, because in this investigation, time is everything. At 9:48 in the evening on January 31st, Nancy Guthrie arrived home. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, her Nest doorbell camera was disconnected. At 2:12 in the morning, the camera's internal software registered a motion detection event, A system generated alert classifying what it sensed as a person. At 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker application on Nancy Guthrie's smartphone lost its connection to the implanted device. At 11:56 in the morning, her family arrived at her home after she failed to appear for a virtual church service. At noon, they called 911. Within hours, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the primary law enforcement jurisdiction for the Catalina foothills area, had deployed drones, canine search units, and significant personnel resources to the scene. Sheriff Chris Nanos would later state publicly that all physical evidence pointed to one conclusion. Nancy Guthrie had been removed from her home against her will. He did not hedge. He used the word abduction. What the investigators found at the scene confirmed that this was not a voluntary departure. Her personal belongings remained inside the home. Her phone, the device connected to her pacemaker, the device she used to communicate with family, the device that any 84-year-old woman with serious health issues would consider essential was left behind. Her medication, which she required daily and which her daughter, Savannah, would later describe publicly as necessary for her survival, was left behind. Her keys, her ordinary items of daily life, all of it present inside the house, untouched, as though time had simply stopped. Outside the front door of the residence, there was blood. Not a small amount, consistent with an accidental cut. Blood that law enforcement photographed, documented, and submitted for forensic analysis. Subsequent DNA testing confirmed what investigators suspected. The blood matched Nancy Guthrie's genetic profile. Her blood was on her own porch, and she was not inside her house. There was also evidence, according to official statements, that the doorbell camera at the front of the residence had been physically manipulated or removed at some point. The precise timeline of that physical tampering relative to the electronic disconnection, recorded at 1:47, would become relevant as the case developed. Law enforcement also confirmed that there were no obvious signs of forced entry inside the home itself. No broken windows, no damaged door frames. But the camera tampering and the blood and the missing woman combined to paint a picture that the Pima County Sheriff's Department accepted from the earliest hours of the investigation. This was an abduction. The case moved quickly into a multi-agency operation. The FBI's Phoenix field office joined within the first 24 to 48 hours. United States Customs and Border Protection was involved. Given the proximity to the international boundary with Mexico, a relevant consideration in any kidnapping case in southern Arizona, where the border is close and crossing points are numerous. Search and rescue teams were deployed. Neighborhood canvassing began. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from homes and businesses in the surrounding area. The case became, almost immediately, national news. And then, as this investigation's most defining complication took shape, the ransom notes arrived. Beginning as early as February 3rd, just 2 days after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, multiple media outlets began receiving what appeared to be communications from people claiming to hold her. TMZ received a note. So did local Arizona television stations KGUN9 and Cold. The notes made clear demands: payment in Bitcoin, with specific wallet addresses and specific deadlines. According to reports reviewed by blockchain forensics experts and cryptocurrency analysts who spoke to national outlets, the initial ransom demand was approximately $6 million. This was not a casual sum. This was not a demand from someone improvising. $6 million in Bitcoin, to a specific wallet address, by a specific deadline. The notes that arrived at TMZ claimed to be from Nancy Guthrie's captors, from people who said they had her and would release her for payment. What they were not, at any point, was confirmed as legitimate by the FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department posted publicly that they were aware of reports circulating about possible ransom notes and that all tips and leads were taken seriously and forwarded to detectives coordinating with the FBI. That is a carefully worded protocol statement. It does not constitute authentication of any ransom note, and the FBI never publicly stated that they believed they were dealing with a genuine ransom demand from Nancy Guthrie's actual captors. Meanwhile, the Guthrie family was facing an impossible situation. They were receiving communications that identified themselves as coming from whoever was holding their mother. They had no way to independently know whether those communications were real. They were desperate, they were frightened, and they made decisions in public that reflected that desperation. Savannah Guthrie, appearing on social media with her brother Cameron and her sister Annie, said they had received a message. She said they understood. She said they were begging for their mother to be returned to them, and that they would pay. The video was watched by millions of people. It was one of the most genuinely heartbreaking pieces of public communication to emerge from any American missing persons case in years. A famous woman, stripped of every professional composure, simply asking someone in the darkness to give her mother back. But here is what was happening simultaneously, behind the scenes, that was not part of the public narrative at the time. An FBI spokesperson stated that the agency was not aware of any ongoing direct communication between the Guthrie family and possible kidnappers. even as the family's video appeared to confirm that contact was occurring and that they were willing to pay. That discrepancy, the FBI saying they were unaware of contact, the family appearing to confirm contact was occurring, is not a minor inconsistency. In a sophisticated federal investigation involving potential ransom negotiation, the Bureau would normally be the entity coordinating any communication with captors. The fact that a deadline was approaching February 9th and the FBI was publicly stating they were not aware of direct communication raises serious questions about the nature of what the family was actually receiving. That Monday evening deadline came and went. TMZ reported that the Bitcoin wallet associated with the alleged demand showed no incoming payment by the time the deadline passed. The following day, a transaction worth approximately $6 million was recorded on the Bitcoin blockchain in connection with the wallet's address. Cryptocurrency experts who spoke to Fox News Digital assessed it as almost certainly unrelated to the Guthrie case. Large Bitcoin transactions occur regularly across the blockchain, and the timing was likely coincidental. But the episode illustrated how completely the ransom narrative had taken over the public understanding of this case, and how difficult it had become to separate what was real from what was noise. Now let us examine what the physical forensic record, independent of any ransom communications, actually showed investigators. On February 10th, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, FBI Director Kash Patel released surveillance footage that represented the most significant forensic development of the investigation to that point. The existence of this footage was itself remarkable. When investigators first arrived, the Nest doorbell camera had been physically disconnected. Nancy Guthrie did not have an active subscription to cloud storage that would automatically back up video in real time. Under normal circumstances, a disconnected camera with no cloud backup means no footage. But the FBI partnered with Google, the parent company of Nest, and forensic engineers worked to extract residual data from back-end systems associated with the device. What they recovered was incomplete and grainy, captured in black and white. But it showed something that changed the public face of this investigation. The footage showed a masked individual approaching Nancy Guthrie's front door. The person wore dark clothing, long sleeves, and pants. They wore gloves, a detail that would become forensically significant within days. They carried a backpack with reflective straps. They appeared to have a firearm in a holster positioned across the center of their waist, a carry position that Sheriff Nanos described as improper, inconsistent with trained law enforcement carry methods. Their face was covered by a mask, a balaclava. Their mustache was visible beneath it. The footage showed the individual raising one gloved hand toward the camera lens, attempting to block it. When that failed, they reached into a nearby decorative planter, extracted a branch or clipping of foliage, and physically placed the vegetation in front of the camera lens. This act revealed something important. Whoever approached that door was aware there was a camera. They came prepared to deal with it. When their initial approach failed, they improvised, using the immediate environment to complete their objective. This was not random. This required prior knowledge of the property. By February 12th, forensic analysis had produced enough detail for the FBI to release a physical description of the suspect. Male, average build, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. A black mustache visible beneath the lower edge of the mask. The backpack was specifically identified as a black 25-liter model from the Ozark Trail Hiker pack line, sold exclusively through Walmart, in stores and online. Investigators immediately began working with Walmart management to identify purchase records for that specific item, cross-referencing with geographic and timing parameters. They also canvassed gun shops in the Tucson area, showing doorbell footage to employees, asking if anyone recognized the suspect. The tip lines generated staggering volume. Between the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department, investigators eventually reported receiving between 40,000 and 50,000 individual tips. Fabian Pacheco, the chief of detectives for the Pima County Attorney's Office, told CBS News that approximately 10% of those leads had investigative value between 4,000 and 5,000 leads, requiring meaningful attention. On the night of February 10th, while the doorbell footage was still generating national attention, a person of interest was detained during a traffic stop in the Rio Rico area, approximately 60 miles south of Tucson toward the Mexican border. Law enforcement sources told ABC News the individual was identified through electronic investigative tools including phone location data and traffic pattern analysis. His home was searched. He was questioned for several hours. He was released without charges. He identified himself to reporters as Carlos Palazuelos, said he made commercial deliveries in the Tucson region, and denied any involvement. A second court-authorized search took place on the evening of February 13th, approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, based on what Sheriff Nanos described as a lead that developed into a search warrant. Multiple individuals were questioned. No arrests resulted. What investigators found during that search has not been publicly disclosed. On February 11th, searchers found a glove in a roadside field, approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The glove visually matched the type worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage. Approximately 16 gloves total were collected in the surrounding search area, but investigators determined the vast majority belonged to volunteers who discarded them while working the search. This particular glove stood out. It was sent to a forensic laboratory in Florida for DNA analysis and submitted to CODI's the Combined DNA Index System, the FBI-managed national database containing DNA profiles from more than 26 million individuals. The result, no match, 0 hits. The DNA profile of an unknown male extracted from the glove did not correspond to anyone in the federal database. Then, in early March, investigators revealed the glove had been traced back entirely. It belonged to a local restaurant worker in the Tucson area who had discarded it in the field and had no connection to the case whatsoever. Another thread, carefully pulled, leading nowhere. Simultaneously, DNA evidence recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's property. DNA that did not match her or anyone in her immediate circle was undergoing analysis. A source close to the investigation told CBS News this DNA was described as low-level, meaning the sample might not be sufficient to generate a complete, usable profile. Investigators did not rule out submitting it to genetic genealogy databases, commercial services like Ancestry or 23andMe, which contain millions of voluntarily submitted profiles. This technique, which identified the Golden State Killer more than 4 decades after his crimes, could potentially establish a familial connection to the unknown DNA, even if the suspect themselves has never been tested or arrested. Whether this has been or will be applied to the Guthrie case has not been confirmed publicly. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker represents another forensic thread that has received insufficient public attention. Investigators confirmed they were actively attempting to locate the physical device, working with the manufacturer and with specialists in cardiac implant forensics. A modern pacemaker is not merely a mechanical tool, it is a data recording instrument. It logs cardiac events with precise timestamps. Some models transmit data wirelessly to paired devices or external monitoring stations. If recovered, the pacemaker could potentially tell investigators whether Nancy Guthrie experienced cardiac distress events and when, provide timestamps correlated with other evidence, and in some configurations, information about the wireless electromagnetic environment the device was operating in, which could help narrow her geographic location at specific times. The Sheriff's Department also reported that investigators deployed a signal detection device described by sources as a signal sniffer, designed to pick up electronic emissions that could potentially identify a pacemaker or similar medical device transmitting in a search area. Whether that technology produced actionable results has not been disclosed. And then the investigation entered its most analytically complicated phase. Somewhere between the first ransom note arriving at TMZ in February and the investigation entering its 3rd month with no confirmed suspect and no confirmed location, a new pattern emerged in the communications flowing into newsrooms. A pattern that suggests the ransom apparatus in this case may represent a crime running parallel to and layered on top of the original abduction. Beginning in mid-February, a specific individual began contacting TMZ repeatedly. This person's communications were distinct from the initial ransom notes in a critical way. The original notes claimed to be from Nancy Guthrie's captors, from people who said they had her and would release her for payment. This new individual did not claim to have her. This person claimed to have information about the kidnappers and offered to sell that information in exchange for Bitcoin. 1 Bitcoin, worth approximately $34,000 at the time of the most recent communications in early April 2026. This is a fundamentally different proposition. It is the offer of an alleged informant, someone who claims to be a witness rather than a participant, who says they saw something, know something, and are choosing to monetize that knowledge rather than report it through official channels. The questions this raises are immediate and serious. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department had a combined reward fund exceeding $100,000, available to anyone providing credible, actionable information. The Guthrie family had separately posted a $1 million private reward. Together, more than $1,100,000. Accessible through official channels, potentially with legal protections for the informant's identity, no cryptocurrency required. So why was this individual demanding 1 Bitcoin, worth approximately 3% of the available legitimate reward, through a media outlet, rather than calling 1-800? Detective Brian Martin, a cold case specialist who appeared on News Nation, raised this question directly. He said there were 2 credible explanations for someone demanding Bitcoin through media rather than using official channels. Either they had genuine involvement in the crime and feared legal exposure from direct contact with law enforcement, or they had no real information and were attempting to exploit the situation for financial gain. Both explanations are alarming. For different reasons. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer offered a different analytical frame. She argued publicly that paying the 1 Bitcoin might actually serve investigative purposes, not because the information was necessarily credible, but because Bitcoin, despite its reputation for pseudonymity, is fundamentally traceable. The Bitcoin blockchain is a permanent public ledger. Every transaction is recorded and visible. The moment funds move to or from a specific wallet address, investigators can begin mapping the entire network of transaction history associated with that address. Converting Bitcoin to spendable currency to actual dollars or pesos or any usable form of money requires, at some point, interaction with exchanges or financial services that have compliance requirements, identity verification processes, and records that law enforcement can access through legal process. Coffin-Defer argued that paying the fee could give investigators a forensic thread on the blockchain worth following. She also noted that the timing of the April 2026 communications arriving on the same day. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show anchor desk for the first time since her mother vanished was not coincidental. The person sending these notes was monitoring the news cycle and calibrating their communications to generate maximum media impact. That observation matters. It suggests an actor who is watching events closely and choosing when to inject themselves into the story for effect. But then came the detail that collapsed any remaining analytical coherence in this particular round of communications. The same individual who had been demanding Bitcoin for information about the kidnappers, who claimed throughout to be a witness rather than a participant, sent notes to TMZ in early April that directly contradicted each other. In one note, the sender claimed to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive in the Mexican state of Sonora, south of the Arizona border. In another note, reportedly from the same sender, in the same communication cycle, the person stated that Nancy Guthrie was dead, that they knew where her remains were, that the FBI had wasted millions of dollars on the search because it refused to pay for the information being offered. Alive in Sonora, dead with a known location. Both claims attributed to the same individual. Both claims impossible to reconcile. A person cannot be simultaneously alive in Mexico and dead in an accessible location known to the sender. One or both of those claims is a fabrication, and if someone is fabricating claims about the fate of a missing 84-year-old woman in order to extract cryptocurrency payments from media outlets or the public, that is not a frustrated witness navigating a complex situation. That is fraud. The FBI has not confirmed any element of these claims. No public indication has been given that these communications changed the direction or focus of the investigation. This brings us to the factual anchor that changes how all ransom communications in this case must be evaluated. The arrest of Derek Colella is a Southern California man who was arrested, charged in federal court in Arizona, arraigned, and required to submit to pretrial monitoring of his electronic devices. The federal charge against him, sending fake ransom demands via text messages, targeted at the Guthrie family, beginning on February 4th, 3 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Federal prosecutors stated explicitly that Colella was attempting to profit from the situation. The FBI stated explicitly that there was no evidence connecting him to Nancy Guthrie's actual disappearance. He was not her captor. He was not a witness. He was an opportunist who saw a national news story about a desperate family and tried to extract money by impersonating their mother's kidnapper. That man is a real person. That federal charge is a real federal charge in a real court in Arizona. That arrest happened, and it establishes, with the full weight of federal prosecutorial authority, that in this specific case, individuals attempted to commit ransom fraud by exploiting Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The logical question that follows is unavoidable. How many others did the same thing without getting caught? How many of the notes received by TMZ, by KGUN, by KOLD? How many of the emails and text messages in Bitcoin addresses flooding into newsrooms and tip lines were generated by people like Derek Colella, who had no connection to the disappearance but recognized a high-profile case as a financial opportunity? Savannah Guthrie answered this question herself, with unusual directness. In an interview on the Today Show, she stated that she believed most of the ransom notes her family received were fake. Most of them, the family at the center of this case, the people with the most intimate knowledge of every communication received, the most motivation to carefully evaluate each one, working with their own legal and investigative advisors, concluded that the overwhelming majority of what was presented to them as negotiation was fabrication. If most ransom notes were fake, the investigative implications are severe. 40,000 to 50,000 tips. Dozens of ransom communications across multiple outlets. Federal agents and local investigators, whose time, expertise, and resources are finite, consumed by the analysis of communications that were, by the family's own assessment, mostly fraudulent. The real perpetrators of Nancy Guthrie's abduction, if they ever communicated at all, may have been able to remain silent and invisible while a cascade of opportunists generated a convincing illusion of active ransom negotiation. A cloud of noise obscuring whatever signal, if any, existed. There is also the matter of investigative leadership, a dimension of this case that has received less coverage than it deserves. A law enforcement insider, speaking to Nation, alleged that the Pima County Sheriff's team assigned to lead this investigation included supervisory personnel who had never previously worked a homicide case. That insider alleged that mistakes were made early in the investigation. The specific nature of those mistakes was not described in detail in public reporting, but the allegation itself that the lead investigative agency placed supervisors without relevant experience at the head of the highest-profile case in Arizona, in recent memory, is deeply concerning if accurate. The Pima County Deputies Union, representing more than 300 officers, passed a unanimous no-confidence vote against Sheriff Chris Nanos during the period surrounding this investigation. Every deputy in that union voted no confidence in the county's top law enforcement official. The specific connection between that vote and the handling of the Guthrie investigation has not been definitively established in public reporting, but the vote was unanimous, and the timing is difficult to set aside. The FBI's involvement would presumably provide significant analytical and forensic counterweight to any shortcomings in local investigative management. The Bureau brings resources and investigative depth that county agencies cannot match. But the lead agency designation has remained with the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and the combined investigative apparatus, federal, state, local, has not yet produced an arrest, a confirmed suspect, a verified proof of life, or a confirmed location for Nancy Guthrie. Now let us examine the theories that the current evidence supports, with the analytical discipline the evidence demands. The first theory, a premeditated kidnapping for ransom, carried out by one or more individuals who surveilled Nancy Guthrie's home, planned the entry, disabled the camera, removed her against her will, and have been attempting to collect cryptocurrency ransom since. The physical evidence at the scene is consistent with this theory. The blood matching Nancy Guthrie's DNA indicates violence or injury at her home on the night of her disappearance. The tampered doorbell camera indicates deliberate action to reduce electronic witness capacity before the abduction. The pacemaker app, disconnecting at 2:28, indicates some disruption to the phone device link, possibly because the phone was removed from the property, or because the phone's proximity to the device was broken by physical movement. The personal items left inside indicate she did not leave voluntarily. The doorbell footage shows a masked, armed individual approaching the property with apparent foreknowledge of its layout and security. These elements, taken together, present a coherent picture of a planned abduction. The primary weakness of this theory, as currently evidenced, is the sustained absence of verifiable communication from actual captors. Professional kidnapping operations seeking significant ransoms almost universally establish proof of life early in the negotiation process. That proof of life is the leverage. Without it, there is no credible threat, no reason to pay, and no path to a successful transaction. The absence of verified proof of life for more than 60 days. In a case that received more sustained national media coverage than virtually any other missing persons case in American history, during that period, is deeply anomalous within the framework of a competent ransom operation. The second theory, the original abduction is real, but the ransom demand infrastructure was either entirely fraudulent from the beginning, or was immediately co-opted by opportunists to the point where genuine communication from actual captors, if it existed at all, became indistinguishable from the noise generated by fraudsters. Under this theory, someone took Nancy Guthrie for reasons that may not be primarily financial, or for financial reasons through channels that never intersected with the public media circus. The ransom notes flooding newsrooms were, under this scenario, the work of opportunists responding to a high-profile news event, not communications from her actual captors. The strength of this theory, it explains why no ransom communication was ever authenticated by the FBI, why no proof of life was produced, despite the financial incentive to do so, and why Savannah Guthrie herself concluded that most of the notes were fake. The weakness, it still leaves Nancy Guthrie's fate entirely unknown and the actual perpetrators entirely unidentified. The third theory, the one gaining the most analytical traction in expert circles connected to federal law enforcement analysis, the ransom framework itself was deliberate misdirection. Under this scenario, whoever took Nancy Guthrie did not do so primarily for money. The ransom notes, or at least some of them, may have been generated by the actual perpetrators not as a genuine negotiating strategy, but as a tool to complicate the investigation, to focus law enforcement and media attention on cryptocurrency wallets and Bitcoin deadlines, rather than on the doorbell footage, the backpack, the DNA evidence, the pacemaker signal, to flood the analytical environment with noise, while the signal, the actual crime, remained obscured. This scenario implies a level of sophistication that goes beyond opportunistic crime. It implies someone who understood how high-profile disappearances function in the modern media environment, who understood that ransom notes would generate immediate, intense, sustained coverage that would dominate the narrative for weeks, and who designed that element of the cover story accordingly. The evidence supports parts of each of these theories. Each leaves critical gaps that cannot be closed with the current public record. What we know about the state of this investigation, as of early April 2026, is this: no arrests have been made, no verified proof of life has been produced, no remains have been found. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department have confirmed that Nancy Guthrie's condition and whereabouts remain unknown. The investigation remains active. Between 40,000 and 50,000 tips have been reviewed. The FBI is offering $100,000 for actionable information. The Guthrie family is offering a separate $1 million private reward. Savannah Guthrie has returned to work, appearing on the Today Show for the first time since her mother vanished, while the search continues. And a person who may be a witness, a fraud, or something more complicated still, is sending notes to TMZ, simultaneously claiming Nancy Guthrie is alive in Mexico and dead in an accessible location. The blockchain is traceable. The backpack sold at Walmart has a purchase history somewhere in a database. The doorbell footage has been enhanced and studied by forensic analysts. The tools available to the FBI: genetic genealogy, signal analysis, blockchain forensics, enhanced surveillance review, continue to evolve and expand. Somewhere in the intersection between a man with a backpack and a balaclava, a disconnected camera, a pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning, and a wave of ransom communications that a federal prosecutor has already proven can be fabricated for profit, somewhere in all of that is the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Whether investigators can reach that truth before it becomes unreachable depends on evidence, on forensic threads carefully pulled, on the separation of signal from noise in a case that has been defined almost entirely by noise. This is a real life, a real family. An 84-year-old woman who went home after dinner on a Saturday night, closed her garage door, and was gone before the sun came up. A daughter who stepped away from a national television career to search for her mother, who stood before the country and said she would pay anything, who returned to her desk on live television while the investigation continued in the desert. This is not just a story, it is a real life, a real family, in a case that may still have answers waiting to be found, if the evidence can be read clearly enough to point the way. The search for truth continues. Think carefully about what the doorbell footage actually implies. A masked, armed individual approached the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home in the middle of the night, not just any night, but the specific night that she returned home from a family dinner. At 1:47 in the morning, that person was already at the door, prepared to disable the camera, carrying a backpack, wearing gloves that they would later discard 2 miles away. The camera was disconnected within minutes of their arrival. At 2:12 in the morning, motion was detected near the house. At 2:28, the pacemaker app went silent. The question investigators have not answered publicly is this: how did whoever approached that door know that Nancy Guthrie would be home that night? She had spent the evening at her daughter Annie's house. She used a rideshare service to get there and was driven home by her son-in-law. These are not activities that are publicly broadcast or that would be visible to a random stranger. Someone who intended to abduct Nancy Guthrie at her home in the middle of that specific night would need to have known either that she was there or that she was predictably home on Saturday evenings. Either answer has significant implications. If the perpetrator had been conducting surveillance of the property over an extended period, watching her routine, mapping her schedule, learning when she came and went and who dropped her off, that suggests a level of premeditation and patience that moves this crime out of the category of opportunistic or impulsive violence and into the category of targeted, organized criminal action. Someone who spent days or weeks watching an 84-year-old woman's home, learning her routine, identifying the camera, and planning to disable it, obtaining a specific backpack and specific clothing and a firearm. This is not the profile of a crime committed on impulse. If the perpetrator had inside information, if they knew Nancy Guthrie's schedule because someone in her social or family circle shared it, knowingly or unknowingly, that opens a different set of investigative questions. Sheriff Chris Nanos went to significant public lengths to state that all family members and their spouses had been cleared as suspects. He described the suggestion that any family member was involved as cruel. That public statement, in the context of an active investigation, serves a dual purpose. It provides information to the public, and it signals to the family that they are not under active scrutiny. But the clearing of family members as direct suspects does not resolve the question of how the perpetrator knew to be at that door on that night. Surveillance and inside information are not the only explanations. There may be others, but both warrant serious analytical consideration. The FBI, according to law enforcement sources, deployed electronic investigative tools beyond the standard canvas, including what was described by sources as a signal sniffer, a device capable of detecting electromagnetic emissions in a search area, potentially including signals from medical devices like pacemakers. The FBI also reportedly began examining gun purchases in the Tucson area, on the theory that a suspect acquiring a firearm shortly before the abduction might have left a paper trail through licensed dealers who are required to record sales. Investigators were canvassing Walmart locations to trace the specific backpack seen in the doorbell footage. Each of these investigative threads represents a potential path to the suspect's identity. None has produced a public result. There is also the geographic dimension of this case that deserves serious attention. Nancy Guthrie's home, in the Catalina foothills, is located in a part of Arizona where the international border with Mexico is approximately 60 to 70 miles to the south. The Rio Rico property searched in connection with this investigation sits south of Tucson, in the corridor between the city and the border crossing infrastructure. The most recent round of ransom communications referenced Sonora, the Mexican state immediately across the border from Arizona's Pima County. Investigators, including United States Customs and Border Protection, were part of the multi-agency response from the beginning. The border dimension of this case matters for several reasons. If Nancy Guthrie was moved across the international boundary, willingly or by force, the jurisdictional complexity of the investigation increases dramatically. Mexican federal and state law enforcement agencies operate under different legal frameworks. Evidence collection, witness cooperation, and extradition all involve diplomatic and legal processes that extend well beyond what a county sheriff's department can manage unilaterally. The FBI has established relationships with Mexican law enforcement and has international legal authority that the Pima County Sheriff's Department does not. But even with FBI involvement, cross-border investigations are slower, harder, and more susceptible to information gaps than domestic cases. The anonymous communication referencing Sonora from a sender who also claims Nancy Guthrie is dead may be entirely fabricated. But the geographic reference is not random. Sonora is where you would go if you took someone across the border from the Tucson area. It is the obvious route south. Either the sender knows that because they were actually there, or they know it because anyone with a basic map and knowledge of the region knows it. That ambiguity cannot be resolved without either authenticating or definitively discrediting the communication, something that, again, the FBI has not done publicly. As we move toward an assessment of what the next investigative steps might look like, we have to grapple with something uncomfortable. The possibility that this case, as structured, may be approaching a ceiling on what conventional investigative methods can accomplish with the evidence currently available. The Kodos hit failed. The glove was traced to an unrelated person. The persons of interest detained have been released. The searches conducted under warrants have not produced public announcements of breakthrough findings. The DNA from the property may be too degraded to profile. The pacemaker has not been located. The Bitcoin wallets associated with ransom demands have not been publicly connected to identifiable individuals. What remains? In terms of forensic possibility, genetic genealogy stands as perhaps the most significant, unexplored tool in this investigation. The DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property, if it can be profiled, sufficiently can be submitted to commercial genealogy databases, even if the suspect themselves has never submitted a DNA sample. A parent, sibling, or first cousin who participated in a consumer genealogy test could be enough to establish a familial link and begin narrowing the identity of the unknown person. This is not a hypothetical technique. It has been used successfully in cases where all other investigative avenues had been exhausted, including cases that were cold for decades. The question in the Guthrie case is whether the quality of the available DNA sample is sufficient to support this process. The backpack remains a potentially valuable forensic and investigative thread. The Ozark Trail Hiker Pack, sold exclusively through Walmart, is a specific enough product that investigators should theoretically be able to narrow the purchase history significantly. If the backpack was bought in a brick-and-mortar Walmart using a credit or debit card, that transaction is on record. If it was bought online, the shipping address is on record. Even a cash purchase in a physical store generates potentially useful metadata: the specific store location, the date and time of the transaction, the register where the sale was processed, and potentially surveillance footage from the store at that time. The Walmart backpack thread has not been publicly closed. The doorbell footage itself, while limited, has been subjected to enhancement and analysis by FBI forensic technicians. Modern forensic image enhancement can sometimes extract information from footage that appears unusable to the naked eye. Details in the background, reflections in surfaces, license plate numbers of vehicles visible at the edge of a frame. Whether that analysis has produced actionable results has not been disclosed. And then there is what might be the most straightforward investigative path. Someone who knows something has not yet come forward, but the combination of increasing reward funds and the passage of time may change that calculation. $1,100,000 in combined reward money has been available throughout this investigation. The FBI has said the tip volume is in the range of 40 to 50,000 individual submissions. Investigators have said approximately 10% of those have investigative value. That means roughly 4,000 to 5,000 leads are receiving active attention. In a case with this level of public profile and this much financial incentive to provide information, the investigative consensus across most major cases is that eventually, someone who knows something decides that the risk of silence outweighs the risk of speaking. Informants emerge. Associates talk. The person who sold the backpack, drove a car, made a phone call, or simply saw something that night eventually becomes uncomfortable enough with their silence that they contact someone. That moment has not yet come in the Nancy Guthrie case. Whether it will come depends on factors that no public analysis can fully assess. What we can say is that this investigation, as of April 2026, represents an extraordinary convergence of forensic complexity, media saturation, potential fraud layered on top of potential abduction, institutional questions about investigative competence, geographic challenges involving international boundaries, and the sustained absence of the one thing that would clarify everything: direct, verifiable knowledge of where Nancy Guthrie is and what happened to her. The ransom may have been a fraud. It may have been a cover. It may have been a genuine but incompetent attempt at extortion that failed. It may have been a sophisticated misdirection, engineered by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The evidence that exists, the doorbell footage, the blood, the timestamps, the DNA, the pacemaker signal, the backpack, is real and is being analyzed. The communications that flooded newsrooms, the Bitcoin demands, the deadlines, the contradictory claims of life and death may represent a crime entirely separate from the abduction. A fraud case layered on top of a kidnapping case, both of them unsolved, both of them ongoing. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is still working the case. The FBI is still working the case. The family is still posting rewards and making public appeals. Savannah Guthrie is back at her desk on the Today Show, doing her job. In the same way that people in extraordinary pain often perform the most ordinary functions because the ordinary functions are all that remain to hold on to. And somewhere, in Tucson, or across a border, or in a forensic database, or in the memory of someone who has not yet decided to speak, the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie exists. The question that this investigation has not yet answered is whether the investigative apparatus surrounding this case will find that answer before the weight of time makes it harder to reach. The case file is open. The evidence is real. The family is waiting, and the search for truth continues. The person who sent the April notes to TMZ claiming to know both that Nancy Guthrie was alive in Sonora and that she was dead, accused the FBI of wasting millions of dollars and dismissed the agency as arrogant for treating their communications as a scam. That language, that framing, that accusation, is itself revealing. It is the language of someone who is frustrated that they are not being taken seriously. It does not sound like a frightened witness navigating danger. It sounds like someone who expected a transaction to occur and is angry that the other party has not complied. Whether that anger is the anger of a genuine informant being ignored, or the anger of a fraudster being rightfully dismissed, only investigators with access to the full intelligence picture can determine. What we can assess from the public record is this: the profile of this communication, across multiple months, is more consistent with fraud and exploitation than with legitimate whistleblowing or witness cooperation. The internal contradictions are too severe. The timing of communications is too calibrated to media cycles to reflect panic or spontaneity. The demands for cryptocurrency rather than engagement with official channels are too inconsistent with the behavior of someone who genuinely wants credit for solving the case. That assessment may be wrong. The evidence may support parts of this person's claims, but based on what the public record shows, the contradictions, the timing, the refusal to use official channels despite the availability of significant legitimate reward money, investigators and the public should apply serious scrutiny before treating any of these communications as a credible window into what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie. The case remains open. The investigation is active. And somewhere, beyond the noise, the truth is waiting.